Chapter 10. There was no way of getting into or out of the top garden at San Salvatore except through the two glass doors, unfortunately side by side of the dining room and the hall. A person in the garden who wished to escape unseen could not, for the person to be escaped from would be met on the way. It was a small, oblong garden, and concealment was impossible. What trees there were! The Judas tree, the tamarisk, the umbrella pine, grew close to the low parapets. Rose bushes gave no real cover. One step to right or left of them, and the person wishing to be private was discovered. Only the northwest corner was a little place jutting out from the great wall, a kind of excrescence or loop, no doubt used in the old distrustful days for observation, where it was possible to sit really unseen, because between it and the house was a thick clump of daphne. Scrap, after glancing round to see that no one was looking, got up and carried her chair into this place, stealing away as carefully on tiptoe as those steal whose purpose is sin. There was another excrescence on the walls just like it at the northeast corner, but this, though the view from it was almost more beautiful, for from it you could see the bay and the lovely mountains behind Mezzago, was exposed. No bushes grew near it, nor had it any shade. The northwest loop, then, was where she would sit, and she settled into it, and nestling her head in her cushion and putting her feet comfortably on the parapet, from whence they appeared to the villagers on the piazza below as two white doves, thought that now indeed she would be safe. Mrs. Fisher found her there, guided by the smell of her cigarette. The incautious Scrap had not thought of that. Mrs. Fisher did not smoke herself, and all the more distinctly could she smell the smoke of others. The virile smell met her directly. She went out into the garden from the dining room after lunch in order to have her coffee. She had bidden Francesca set the coffee in the shade of the house just outside the glass door, and when Mrs. Wilkins, seeing a table being carried there, reminded her, very officiously and tactlessly, Mrs. Fisher considered, that Lady Caroline wanted to be alone, she retorted, and with what propriety, that the garden was for everybody. Into it accordingly she went, and was immediately aware that Lady Caroline was smoking. She said to herself, "These modern young women," and proceeded to find her stick, now that lunch was over, being no longer the hindrance to action that it was before her meal had been securely, as Browning once said. Surely it was Browning. Yes, she remembered how much diverted she had been. Roped in. Nobody diverted her now, reflected Mrs. Fisher, making straight for the clump of daphne. The world had grown very dull, and had entirely lost its sense of humor. Probably they still had their jokes, these people. In fact, she knew they did, for Punch still went on, but how differently it went on, and what jokes! Thackeray, in his inimitable way, would have made mincemeat of this generation. Of how much it needed, the tonic properties of that astringent pen, it was of course unaware. It no longer even held him, at least, so she had been informed, in any particular esteem. Well, she could not give it eyes to see, and ears to hear, and a heart to understand, but she could and would give it, represented and united in the form of Lady Caroline, a good dose of honest medicine. "I hear you are not well," she said, standing in the narrow entrance of the loop and looking down with the inflexible face of one who is determined to do good at the motionless and apparently sleeping Scrap. Mrs. Fisher had a deep voice, very like a man's, for she had been overtaken by that strange masculinity that sometimes pursues a woman during the last lapse of her life. Scrap tried to pretend that she was asleep, but if she had been, her cigarette would not have been held in her fingers, but would have been lying on the ground. She forgot this. Mrs. Fisher did not, and coming inside the loop, sat down on a narrow stone seat built out of the wall. For a little, she could sit on it, for a little, till the chill began to penetrate. She contemplated the figure before her, undoubtedly a pretty creature, and one that would have had a success at Farringford. Strange how easily even the greatest men were moved by exteriors. She had seen with her own eyes Tennyson turn away from everybody. Turn, positively, his back on a crowd of eminent people assembled to do him honor, and withdraw to the window with a young person nobody had ever heard of, who had been brought there by accident and whose one and only merit, if it be a merit, that which is conferred by chance, was beauty. Beauty all over before you can turn round. An affair, one might almost say, of minutes. Well, while it lasted, it did seem able to do what it liked with men. Even husbands were not immune. There had been passages in the life of Mr. Fisher. "I expect the journey has upset you," she said in her deep voice. "What you want is a good dose of some simple medicine. I shall ask Domenico if there is such a thing in the village as castor oil." Scrap opened her eyes and looked straight at Mrs. Fisher. "Ah," said Mrs. Fisher, "I knew you were not asleep. If you had been, you would have let your cigarette fall to the ground." Scrap threw the cigarette over the parapet. "Waste," said Mrs. Fisher. "I don't like smoking for women, but I still less like waste." "What does one do with people like this?" Scrap asked herself, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Fisher in what felt to her an indignant stare, but appeared to Mrs. Fisher as really charming docility. "Now you'll take my advice," said Mrs. Fisher, touched, "and not neglect what may very well turn into an illness. We are in Italy, you know, and one has to be careful. You ought, to begin with, to go to bed." "I never go to bed," snapped Scrap, and it sounded as moving, as forlorn, as that line spoken years and years ago by an actress playing the part of Poor Joe in dramatized version of Bleak House. "I'm always moving on," said Poor Joe in this play, urged to do so by a policeman, and Mrs. Fisher, then a girl, had laid her head on the red velvet parapet of the front row of the dress circle and wept aloud. It was wonderful, Scrap's voice. It had given her, in the 10 years since she came out, all the triumphs that intelligence and wit can have, because it made whatever she said seem memorable. She ought, with a throat formation like that, to have been a singer, but in every kind of music, Scrap was dumb except this one music of the speaking voice, and what a fascination, what a spell lay in that. Such was the loveliness of her face and the beauty of her coloring that there was not a man into whose eyes at the sight of her there did not leap a flame of intensest interest, but, when he heard her voice, the flame in that man's eyes was caught and fixed. It was the same with every man, educated and uneducated, old, young, desirable themselves, or undesirable, men of her own world and bus conductors, generals and Tommies. During the war she had had a perplexing time, bishops equally with vergers. Round about her confirmation startling occurrences had taken place. Wholesome and unwholesome, rich and penniless, brilliant or idiotic, and it made no difference at all what they were, or how long and securely married, into the eyes of every one of them, when they saw her, leapt this flame, and when they heard her, it stayed there. Scrap had had enough of this look. It only led to difficulties. At first it had delighted her. She had been excited, triumphant, to be apparently incapable of doing or saying the wrong thing, to be applauded, listened to, petted, adored wherever she went, and when she came home to find nothing there either but the most indulgent, proud fondness. Why, how extremely pleasant! And so easy, too. No preparation necessary for this achievement, no hard work, nothing to learn. She need take no trouble. She had only to appear and presently say something. But gradually experiences gathered round her. After all, she had to take trouble, she had to make efforts, because, she discovered with astonishment and rage, she had to defend herself. That look, that leaping look, meant that she was going to be grabbed at. Some of those who had it were more humble than others, especially if they were young, but they all, according to their several ability, grabbed, and she who had entered the world so jauntily, with her head in the air and the completest confidence in anybody whose hair was gray, began to distrust, and then to dislike, and soon to shrink away from, and presently to be indignant. Sometimes it was just as if she didn't belong to herself, wasn't her own at all, but was regarded as a universal thing, a sort of beauty of all work, really men. And she found herself involved in queer, vague quarrels, being curiously hated, really women. And when the war came and she flung herself into it along with everybody else, it finished her, really generals. The war finished Scrap. It killed the one man she felt safe with, whom she would have married, and it finally disgusted her with love. Since then, she had been embittered. She was struggling as angrily in the sweet stuff of life as a wasp got caught in honey. Just as desperately did she try to unstick her wings. It gave her no pleasure to outdo other women. She didn't want their tiresome men. What could one do with men when one had got them? None of them would talk to her of anything but the things of love, and how foolish and fatiguing that became after a bit. It was as though a healthy person with a normal hunger was given nothing whatever to eat but sugar. Love, love. The very word made her want to slap somebody. "Why should I love you? Why should I?" she would ask amazed sometimes when somebody was trying, somebody was always trying, to propose to her. But she never got a real answer, only further incoherence. A deep cynicism took hold of the unhappy Scrap. Her inside grew hoary with disillusionment, while her gracious and charming outside continued to make the world more beautiful. What had the future in it for her? She would not be able, after such a preparation, to take hold of it. She was fit for nothing. She had wasted all this time being beautiful. Presently she wouldn't be beautiful, and what then? Scrap didn't know what then. It appalled her to wonder even. Tired as she was of being conspicuous, she was at least used to that. She had never known anything else, and to become inconspicuous, to fade, to grow shabby and dim, would probably be most painful. And once she began, what years and years of it there would be. Imagine, thought Scrap, having most of one's life at the wrong end. Imagine being old for 2 or 3 times as long as being young. Stupid, stupid. Everything was stupid. There wasn't a thing she wanted to do. There were thousands of things she didn't want to do. Avoidance, silence, invisibility, if possible, unconsciousness. These negations were all she asked for at the moment, and here, even here, she was not allowed a minute's peace, and this absurd woman must come pretending, merely because she wanted to exercise power and make her go to bed and make her hideous. Drink castor oil, that she thought she was ill. "I'm sure," said Mrs. Fisher, who felt the cold of the stone beginning to come through and knew she could not sit much longer, "you'll do what is reasonable. Your mother would wish." "Have you a mother?" A faint wonder came into Scrap's eyes. "Have you a mother?" If ever anybody had a mother, it was Scrap. It had not occurred to her that there could be people who had never heard of her mother. She was one of the major marchionesses. There being, as no one knew better than Scrap, marchionesses and marchionesses, and had held high positions at court. Her father, too, in his day, had been most prominent. His day was a little over, poor dear, because in the war he had made some important mistakes, and besides he was now grown old. Still, there he was, an excessively well-known person. How restful, how extraordinarily restful to have found someone who had never heard of any of her lot, or at least had not yet connected her with them. She began to like Mrs. Fisher. Perhaps the originals didn't know anything about her either. When she first wrote to them and signed her name, that great name of Dester, which twisted in and out of English history like a bloody thread, for its bearers constantly killed, she had taken it for granted that they would know who she was. And at the interview in Shaftesbury Avenue, she was sure they did know, because they hadn't asked, as they otherwise would have, for references. Scrap began to cheer up. If nobody at San Salvatore had ever heard of her, if for a whole month she could shed herself, get right away from everything connected with herself, be allowed really to forget the clinging and the clogging and all the noise, why, perhaps she might make something of herself after all. She might really think, really clear up her mind, really come to some conclusion. "What I want to do here," she said, leaning forward in her chair and clasping her hands round her knees and looking up at Mrs. Fisher, whose seat was higher than hers, almost with animation. So much pleased was she that Mrs. Fisher knew nothing about her, "is to come to a conclusion. That's all. It isn't much to want, is it? Just that." She gazed at Mrs. Fisher and thought that almost any conclusion would do. The great thing was to get hold of something, catch something tight, cease to drift. Mrs. Fisher's little eyes surveyed her. "I should say," she said, "that what a young woman like you wants is a husband and children." "Well, that's one of the things I'm going to consider," said Scrap amiably, "but I don't think it would be a conclusion." "And meanwhile," said Mrs. Fisher, getting up, for the cold of the stone was now through, "I shouldn't trouble my head if I were you with considerings and conclusions. Women's heads weren't made for thinking, I assure you. I should go to bed and get well." "I am well," said Scrap. "Then why did you send a message that you were ill?" "I didn't." "Then I've had all the trouble of coming out here for nothing." "But wouldn't you prefer coming out and finding me well than coming out and finding me ill?" asked Scrap, smiling. Even Mrs. Fisher was caught by the smile. "Well, you're a pretty creature," she said forgivingly. "It's a pity you weren't born 50 years ago. My friends would have liked looking at you." "I'm very glad I wasn't," said Scrap. "I dislike being looked at." "Absurd," said Mrs. Fisher, growing stern again. "That's what you are made for, young women like you. For what else, pray? And I assure you that if my friends had looked at you, you would have been looked at by some very great people." "I dislike very great people," said Scrap, frowning. There had been an incident quite recently, really potentates. "What I dislike," said Mrs. Fisher, now as cold as the stone she had got up from, "is the pose of the modern young woman. It seems to me pitiful, positively pitiful in its silliness." And, her stick crunching the pebbles, she walked away. "That's all right," Scrap said to herself, dropping back into her comfortable position with her head in the cushion and her feet on the parapet. If only people would go away, she didn't in the least mind why they went. "Don't you think darling Scrap is growing a little, just a little, peculiar?" her mother had asked her father a short time before that latest peculiarity of the flight to San Salvatore, uncomfortably struck by the very odd things Scrap said and the way she had taken to slinking out of reach whenever she could and avoiding everybody except. Such a sign of age. Quite young men, almost boys. Eh? What? Peculiar? Well, let her be peculiar if she likes. A woman with her looks can be any damned thing she pleases, was the infatuated answer. "I do let her," said her mother meekly, and indeed, if she did not, what difference would it make? Mrs. Fisher was sorry she had bothered about Lady Caroline. She went along the hall towards her private sitting-room, and her stick, as she went, struck the stone floor with a vigor in harmony with her feelings. Sheer silliness, these poses. She had no patience with them. Unable to be or do anything of themselves, the young of the present generation tried to achieve a reputation for cleverness by decrying all that was obviously great and obviously good, and by praising everything, however obviously bad. That was different. Apes, thought Mrs. Fisher, roused. Apes, apes. And in her sitting-room she found more apes, or what seemed to her in her present mood, more, for there was Mrs. Arbuthnot placidly drinking coffee, while at the writing table she already looked upon as sacred, using her pen, her own pen brought for her hand alone from Prince of Wales Terrace, sat Mrs. Wilkins writing at the table in her room with her pen. "Isn't this a delightful place?" said Mrs. Arbuthnot cordially. "We have just discovered it." "I'm writing to Mellersh," said Mrs. Wilkins, turning her head and also cordially, as though, Mrs. Fisher thought, she cared a straw who she was writing to and anyhow knew who the person she called Mellersh was. "He'll want to know," said Mrs. Wilkins, optimism induced by her surroundings, "that I've got here safely." Chapter 11. The sweet smells that were everywhere in San Salvatore were alone enough to produce concord. They came into the sitting room from the flowers on the battlements and met the ones from the flowers inside the room, and almost, thought Mrs. Wilkins, could be seen greeting each other with a holy kiss. Who could be angry in the middle of such gentlenesses? Who could be acquisitive, selfish, in the old rasped London way, in the presence of this bounteous beauty? Yet Mrs. Fisher seemed to be all three of these things. There was so much beauty, so much more than enough for everyone, that it did appear to be a vain activity to try and make a corner in it. Yet Mrs. Fisher was trying to make a corner in it and had railed off a portion for her exclusive use. Well, she would get over that presently. She would get over it inevitably. Mrs. Wilkins was sure, after a day or two in the extraordinary atmosphere of peace in that place. Meanwhile, she obviously hadn't even begun to get over it. She stood looking at her and Rose with an expression that appeared to be one of anger. Fancy, silly old nerve-racked London feelings, thought Mrs. Wilkins, whose eyes saw the room full of kisses and everybody in it being kissed, Mrs. Fisher as copiously as she herself and Rose. "You don't like us being in here," said Mrs. Wilkins, getting up and at once, after her manner, fixing on the truth. "Why?" "I should have thought," said Mrs. Fisher, leaning on her stick, "you could have seen that it is my room." "You mean because of the photographs," said Mrs. Wilkins. Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was a little red and surprised, got up too. "And the notepaper," said Mrs. Fisher, "notepaper with my London address on it, that pen." She pointed. It was still in Mrs. Wilkins's hand. "Is yours." "I'm very sorry," said Mrs. Wilkins, laying it on the table, and she added, smiling, that it had just been writing some very amiable things. "But why?" asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, who found herself unable to acquiesce in Mrs. Fisher's arrangements without at least a gentle struggle. "Ought we not to be here? It's a sitting room." "There is another one," said Mrs. Fisher. "You and your friend cannot sit in 2 rooms at once, and if I have no wish to disturb you in yours, I am unable to see why you should wish to disturb me in mine." "But why?" began Mrs. Arbuthnot again. "It's quite natural," Mrs. Wilkins interrupted, for Rose was looking stubborn, and turning to Mrs. Fisher she said that, although sharing things with friends was pleasant, she could understand that Mrs. Fisher, still steeped in the Prince of Wales Terrace attitude to life, did not yet want to, but that she would get rid of that after a bit and feel quite different. "Soon you'll want us to share," said Mrs. Wilkins reassuringly. "Why, you may even get so far as asking me to use your pen if you knew I hadn't got one." Mrs. Fisher was moved almost beyond control by this speech. To have a ramshackle young woman from Hampstead patting her on the back, as it were, in breezy certitude that quite soon she would improve, stirred her more deeply than anything had stirred her since her first discovery that Mr. Fisher was not what he seemed. Mrs. Wilkins must certainly be curbed, but how? There was a curious imperviousness about her. At that moment, for instance, she was smiling as pleasantly and with as unclouded a face as if she were saying nothing in the least impertinent. Would she know she was being curbed? If she didn't know, if she were too tough to feel it, then what? Nothing except avoidance, except precisely one's own private sitting room. "I'm an old woman," said Mrs. Fisher, "and I need a room to myself. I cannot get about because of my stick. As I cannot get about, I have to sit. Why should I not sit quietly and undisturbed, as I told you in London I intended to? If people are to come in and out all day long, chattering and leaving doors open, you will have broken the agreement, which was that I was to be quiet." "But we haven't the least wish," began Mrs. Arbuthnot, who was again cut short by Mrs. Wilkins. "We're only too glad," said Mrs. Wilkins, "for you to have this room if it makes you happy. We didn't know about it, that's all. We wouldn't have come in if we had. Not till you invited us, anyhow. I expect," she finished, looking down cheerfully at Mrs. Fisher, "you soon will." And picking up her letter, she took Mrs. Arbuthnot's hand and drew her towards the door. Mrs. Arbuthnot did not want to go. She, the mildest of women, was filled with a curious and surely unchristian desire to stay and fight, not, of course, really, nor even with any definitely aggressive words. No, she only wanted to reason with Mrs. Fisher and to reason patiently. But she did feel that something ought to be said, and that she ought not to allow herself to be rated and turned out as if she were a schoolgirl caught in ill behavior by authority. Mrs. Wilkins, however, drew her firmly to and through the door, and once again Rose wondered at Lottie, at her balance, her sweet and equable temper. She who in England had been such a thing of gusts. From the moment they got into Italy, it was Lottie who seemed the elder. She certainly was very happy, blissful in fact. Did happiness so completely protect one? Did it make one so untouchable, so wise? Rose was happy herself, but not anything like so happy. Evidently not, for not only did she want to fight Mrs. Fisher, but she wanted something else, something more than this lovely place, something to complete it. She wanted Frederick. For the first time in her life, she was surrounded by perfect beauty, and her one thought was to show it to him, to share it with him. She wanted Frederick. She yearned for Frederick. Ah, if only Frederick. Poor old thing, said Mrs. Wilkins, shutting the door gently on Mrs. Fisher and her triumph. Fancy on a day like this. She's a very rude old thing, said Mrs. Arbuthnot. She'll get over that. I'm sorry we chose just her room to go and sit in. It's much the nicest, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, and it isn't hers. Oh, but there are lots of other places, and she's such a poor old thing. Let her have the room, whatever does it matter. And Mrs. Wilkins said she was going down to the village to find out where the post office was and post her letter to Mellersh, and would Rose go too. I've been thinking about Mellersh, said Mrs. Wilkins as they walked, one behind the other, down the narrow zigzag path up which they had climbed in the rain the night before. She went first. Mrs. Arbuthnot, quite naturally now, followed. In England it had been the other way about. Lottie, timid, hesitating, except when she burst out so awkwardly, getting behind the calm and reasonable Rose whenever she could. I've been thinking about Mellersh, repeated Mrs. Wilkins over her shoulder, as Rose seemed not to have heard. Have you? Said Rose, a faint distaste in her voice, for her experiences with Mellersh had not been of a kind to make her enjoy remembering him. She had deceived Mellersh, therefore she didn't like him. She was unconscious that this was the reason of her dislike, and thought it was that there didn't seem to be much, if any, of the grace of God about him. And yet how wrong to feel that, she rebuked herself, and how presumptuous. No doubt Lottie's husband was far, far nearer to God than she herself was ever likely to be. Still, she didn't like him. I've been a mean dog, said Mrs. Wilkins. A what? Asked Mrs. Arbuthnot, incredulous of her hearing. All this coming away and leaving him in that dreary place, while I rollick in heaven. He had planned to take me to Italy for Easter himself. Did I tell you? No, said Mrs. Arbuthnot, and indeed she had discouraged talk about husbands. Whenever Lottie had begun to blurt out things, she had swiftly changed the conversation. One husband led to another, in conversation as well as in life, she felt, and she could not, she would not, talk of Frederick. Beyond the bare fact that he was there, he had not been mentioned. Mellersh had had to be mentioned because of his obstructiveness, but she had carefully kept him from overflowing outside the limits of necessity. Well, he did, said Mrs. Wilkins. He had never done such a thing in his life before, and I was horrified. Fancy, just as I had planned to come to it myself. She paused on the path and looked up at Rose. Yes, said Rose, trying to think of something else to talk about. Now you see why I say I've been a mean dog. He had planned a holiday in Italy with me, and I had planned a holiday in Italy, leaving him at home. I think, she went on, her eyes fixed on Rose's face, Mellersh has every reason to be both angry and hurt. Mrs. Arbuthnot was astonished. The extraordinary quickness with which, hour by hour, under her very eyes, Lottie became more selfless, disconcerted her. She was turning into something surprisingly like a saint. Here she was now being affectionate about Mellersh. Mellersh, who only that morning, while they hung their feet into the sea, had seemed a mere iridescence, Lottie had told her, a thing of gauze. That was only that morning, and by the time they had had lunch, Lottie had developed so far as to have got him solid enough again to write to, and to write to at length. And now, a few minutes later, she was announcing that he had every reason to be angry with her and hurt, and that she herself had been. The language was unusual, but it did express real penitence. A mean dog. Rose stared at her, astonished. If she went on like this, soon a nimbus might be expected round her head, was there already, if one didn't know it was the sun through the tree trunks catching her sandy hair. A great desire to love and be friends, to love everybody, to be friends with everybody, seemed to be invading Lottie. A desire for sheer goodness. Rose's own experience was that goodness, the state of being good, was only reached with difficulty and pain. It took a long time to get to it. In fact, one never did get to it, or, if for a flashing instant one did, it was only for a flashing instant. Desperate perseverance was needed to struggle along its path, and all the way was dotted with doubts. Lottie simply flew along. She had certainly, thought Rose, not got rid of her impetuousness. It had merely taken another direction. She was now impetuously becoming a saint. Could one really attain goodness so violently? Wouldn't there be an equally violent reaction? I shouldn't, said Rose with caution, looking down into Lottie's bright eyes. The path was steep, so that Lottie was well below her. I shouldn't be sure of that too quickly. But I am sure of it, and I've written and told him so. Rose stared. Why, but only this morning, she began. It's all in this, interrupted Lottie, tapping the envelope and looking pleased. What? Everything? You mean about the advertisement and my savings being spent? Oh no, not yet, but I'll tell him all that when he comes. When he comes? Repeated Rose. I've invited him to come and stay with us. Rose could only go on staring. It's the least I could do. Besides, look at this. Lottie waved her hand, disgusting not to share it. I was a mean dog to go off and leave him, but no dog I've ever heard of was ever as mean as I'd be if I didn't try and persuade Mellersh to come out and enjoy this too. It's barest decency that he should have some of the fun out of my nest egg. After all, he has housed me and fed me for years. One shouldn't be churlish. But, do you think he'll come? Oh, I hope so, said Lottie with the utmost earnestness, and added, poor lamb. At that, Rose felt she would like to sit down. Mellersh? A poor lamb? That same Mellersh who a few hours before was mere shimmer? There was a seat at the bend of the path, and Rose went to it and sat down. She wished to get her breath, gain time. If she had time, she might perhaps be able to catch up the leaping Lottie, and perhaps be able to stop her before she committed herself to what she probably presently would be sorry for. Mellersh at San Salvatore? Mellersh, from whom Lottie had taken such pains so recently to escape. I see him here, said Lottie, as if in answer to her thoughts. Rose looked at her with real concern, for every time Lottie said in that convinced voice, I see, what she saw came true. Then it was to be supposed that Mr. Wilkins, too, would presently come true. I wish, said Rose anxiously, I understood you. Don't try, said Lottie, smiling. But I must, because I love you. Dear Rose, said Lottie, swiftly bending down and kissing her. You're so quick, said Rose. I can't follow your developments. I can't keep touch. It was what happened with Frieder. She broke off and looked frightened. The whole idea of our coming here, she went on again, as Lottie didn't seem to have noticed, was to get away, wasn't it? Well, we've got away, and now, after only a single day of it, you want to write to the very people. She stopped. The very people we were getting away from, finished Lottie. It's quite true. It seems idiotically illogical. But I'm so happy, I'm so well, I feel so fearfully wholesome. This place, why, it makes me feel flooded with love. And she stared down at Rose in a kind of radiant surprise. Rose was silent a moment. Then she said, "And do you think it will have the same effect on Mr. Wilkins?" Lottie laughed. "I don't know," she said, "but even if it doesn't, there's enough love about to flood 50 Mr. Wilkinses, as you call him. The great thing is to have lots of love about. I don't see," she went on, "at least I don't see here, though I did at home, that it matters who loves as long as somebody does. I was a stingy beast at home and used to measure and count. I had a queer obsession about justice. As though justice mattered, as though justice can really be distinguished from vengeance. It's only love that's any good. At home, I wouldn't love Mellersh unless he loved me back exactly as much. Absolute fairness. Did you ever? And as he didn't, neither did I, and the aridity of that house. The aridity—" Rose said nothing. She was bewildered by Lottie. One odd effect of San Salvatore on her rapidly developing friend was her sudden free use of robust words. She had not used them in Hampstead. Beast and dog were more robust than Hampstead cared about. In words, too, Lottie had come unchained. But how she wished, oh, how Rose wished, that she too could write to her husband and say, "Come." The Wilkins ménage, however pompous Mellersh might be, and he had seemed to Rose pompous, was on a healthier, more natural footing than hers. Lottie could write to Mellersh and would get an answer. She couldn't write to Frederick, for only too well did she know he wouldn't answer. At least he might answer. A hurried scribble, showing how much bored he was at doing it, with perfunctory thanks for her letter. But that would be worse than no answer at all, for his handwriting, her name on an envelope addressed by him, stabbed her heart. Too acutely did it bring back the letters of their beginnings together, the letters from him so desolate with separation, so aching with love and longing. To see apparently one of these very same letters arrive, and open it and find, "Dear Rose, thanks for letter. Glad you're having a good time. Don't hurry back. Say if you want any money. Everything going splendidly here. Yours, Frederick." No, it couldn't be borne. "I don't think I'll come down to the village with you today," she said, looking up at Lottie with eyes suddenly gone dim. I want to think." "All right," said Lottie, at once starting off briskly down the path. "But don't think too long," she called back over her shoulder. "Write and invite him at once." "Invite whom?" asked Rose, startled. "Your husband." Chapter 12. At the evening meal, which was the first time the whole four sat round the dining-room table together, Scrap appeared. She appeared quite punctually, and in one of those wrappers or tea-gowns which are sometimes described as ravishing. This one really was ravishing. It certainly ravished Mrs. Wilkins, who could not take her eyes off the enchanting figure opposite. It was a shell-pink garment, and clung to the adorable Scrap as though it, too, loved her. "What a beautiful dress!" exclaimed Mrs. Wilkins eagerly. "What? This old rag?" said Scrap, glancing down at it as if to see which one she had got on. "I've had it 100 years," and she concentrated on her soup. "You must be very cold in it," said Mrs. Fisher, thin-lipped, for it showed a great deal of Scrap. The whole of her arms, for instance, and even where it covered her up, it was so thin that you still saw her. "Who, me?" said Scrap, looking up a moment. "Oh, no." And she continued her soup. "You mustn't catch a chill, you know," said Mrs. Arbuthnot, feeling that such loveliness must at all costs be preserved unharmed. "There's a great difference here when the sun goes down." "I'm quite warm," said Scrap, industriously eating her soup. "You look as if you had nothing at all on underneath," said Mrs. Fisher. "I haven't. At least, hardly anything," said Scrap, finishing her soup. "How very imprudent," said Mrs. Fisher, "and how highly improper." Whereupon Scrap stared at her. Mrs. Fisher had arrived at dinner feeling friendly towards Lady Caroline. She at least had not intruded into her room and sat at her table and written with her pen. She did, Mrs. Fisher had supposed, know how to behave. Now it appeared that she did not know, for was this behaving, to come dressed? No, undressed, like that to a meal? Such behavior was not only exceedingly improper, but also most inconsiderate, for the indelicate creature would certainly catch a chill and then infect the entire party. Mrs. Fisher had a great objection to other people's chills. They were always the fruit of folly, and then they were handed on to her, who had done nothing at all to deserve them. Bird-brained, thought Mrs. Fisher, sternly contemplating Lady Caroline. Not an idea in her head except vanity. "But there are no men here," said Mrs. Wilkins, "so how can it be improper? Have you noticed," she inquired of Mrs. Fisher, who endeavored to pretend she did not hear, "how difficult it is to be improper without men?" Mrs. Fisher neither answered her nor looked at her, but Scrap looked at her and did that with her mouth, which in any other mouth would have been a faint grin. Seen from without, across the bowl of nasturtiums, it was the most beautiful of brief and dimpled smiles. She had a very alive sort of face, that one, thought Scrap, observing Mrs. Wilkins with a dawn of interest. It was rather like a field of corn swept by lights and shadows. Both she and the dark one, Scrap noticed, had changed their clothes, but only in order to put on silk jumpers. The same amount of trouble would have been enough to dress them properly, reflected Scrap. Naturally, they looked like nothing on earth in the jumpers. It didn't matter what Mrs. Fisher wore. Indeed, the only thing for her, short of plumes and ermine, was what she did wear. But these others were quite young still, and quite attractive. They really, definitely had faces. How different life would be for them if they made the most of themselves instead of the least. And yet... Scrap was suddenly bored, and turned away her thoughts and absently ate toast. What did it matter? If you did make the best of yourself, you only collected people round you who ended by wanting to grab. "I've had the most wonderful day," began Mrs. Wilkins, her eyes shining. Scrap lowered hers. "Oh," she thought, "she's going to gush." As though anybody were interested in her day, thought Mrs. Fisher, lowering hers also. In fact, whenever Mrs. Wilkins spoke, Mrs. Fisher deliberately cast down her eyes. Thus would she mark her disapproval. Besides, it seemed the only safe thing to do with her eyes, for no one could tell what the uncurbed creature would say next. That which she had just said, for instance, about men. Addressed to her. What could she mean? Better not conjecture, thought Mrs. Fisher, and her eyes, though cast down, yet saw Lady Caroline stretch out her hand to the Chianti flask and fill her glass again. Again. She had done it once already, and the fish was only just going out of the room. Mrs. Fisher could see that the other respectable member of the party, Mrs. Arbuthnot, was noticing it too. Mrs. Arbuthnot was, she hoped and believed, respectable and well-meaning. It is true she also had invaded her sitting-room, but no doubt she had been dragged there by the other one, and Mrs. Fisher had little, if anything, against Mrs. Arbuthnot, and observed with approval that she only drank water. That was as it should be. So, indeed, to give her dues, did the freckled one, and very right at their age. She herself drank wine, but with what moderation, 1 meal, 1 glass. And she was 65, and might properly and even beneficially have had at least 2. "That," she said to Lady Caroline, cutting right across what Mrs. Wilkins was telling them about her wonderful day and indicating the wine-glass, "is very bad for you." Lady Caroline, however, could not have heard, for she continued to sip, her elbow on the table, and listened to what Mrs. Wilkins was saying. And what was it she was saying? She had invited somebody to come and stay? A man? Mrs. Fisher could not credit her ears. Yet it evidently was a man, for she spoke of the person as he. Suddenly, and for the first time, But then, this was most important, Mrs. Fisher addressed Mrs. Wilkins directly. She was 65 and cared very little what sorts of women she happened to be with for a month, but if the women were to be mixed with men, it was a different proposition altogether. She was not going to be made a cat's paw of. She had not come out there to sanction by her presence what used in her day to be called fast behavior. Nothing had been said at the interview in London about men. If there had been, she would have declined, of course, to come. "What is his name?" asked Mrs. Fisher, abruptly interposing. Mrs. Wilkins turned to her with a slight surprise. "Wilkins," she said. "Wilkins, yes. Her name? And his. A relation? Not blood. A connection? A husband." Mrs. Fisher once more cast down her eyes. She could not talk to Mrs. Wilkins. There was something about the things she said. A husband, suggesting one of many. Always that unseemly twist to everything. Why could she not say, "my husband"? Besides, Mrs. Fisher had, she herself knew not for what reason, taken both the Hampstead young women for widows. War ones. There had been an absence of mention of husbands at the interview, which would not, she considered, be natural if such persons did after all exist, and if a husband was not a relation, who was? Not blood. What a way to talk! Why, a husband was the first of all relations. How well she remembered Ruskin. No, it was not Ruskin. It was the Bible that said a man should leave his father and mother and cleave only to his wife, showing that she became, by marriage, an even more than blood relation. And if the husband's father and mother were to be nothing to him compared to his wife, how much less than nothing ought the wife's father and mother be to her compared to her husband? She herself had been unable to leave her father and mother in order to cleave to Mr. Fisher because they were no longer, when she married, alive, but she certainly would have left them if they had been there to leave. Not blood, indeed. Silly talk. The dinner was very good. Succulence succeeded succulence. Costanza had determined to do as she chose in the matter of cream and eggs the first week, and see what happened at the end of it when the bills had to be paid. Her experience of the English was that they were quiet about bills. They were shy of words. They believed readily. Besides, who was the mistress here? In the absence of a definite one, it occurred to Costanza that she might as well be the mistress herself. So she did as she chose about the dinner, and it was very good. The four, however, were so much preoccupied by their own conversation that they ate it without noticing how good it was. Even Mrs. Fisher, she who in such matters was manly, did not notice. The entire excellent cooking was to her as though it were not, which shows how much she must have been stirred. She was stirred. It was that Mrs. Wilkins. She was enough to stir anybody, and she was undoubtedly encouraged by Lady Caroline, who, in her turn, was no doubt influenced by the Chianti. Mrs. Fisher was very glad there were no men present, for they certainly would have been foolish about Lady Caroline. She was precisely the sort of young woman to unbalance them, especially, Mrs. Fisher recognized at that moment. Perhaps it was the Chianti momentarily intensifying her personality, but she was undeniably most attractive, and there were few things Mrs. Fisher disliked more than having to look on while sensible, intelligent men, who the moment before were talking seriously and interestingly about real matters, became merely foolish and simpering. She had seen them actually simpering, just because in walked a bit of bird-brained beauty. Even Mr. Gladstone, that great wise statesman whose hand had once rested for an unforgettable moment solemnly on her head, would have, she felt, on perceiving Lady Caroline, left off talking sense and horribly embarked on badinage. "You see," Mrs. Wilkins said, a silly trick that with which she mostly began her sentences, Mrs. Fisher each time wished to say, "Pardon me, I do not see, I hear, but why trouble?" "You see," said Mrs. Wilkins, leaning across towards Lady Caroline, "we arranged, didn't we, in London, that if any of us wanted to, we could each invite one guest. So now I'm doing it." "I don't remember that," said Mrs. Fisher, her eyes on her plate. "Oh, yes, we did, didn't we, Rose?" "Yes, I remember," said Lady Caroline, "only it seemed so incredible that one could ever want to. One's whole idea was to get away from one's friends. And one's husbands. Again, that unseemly plural. But how altogether unseemly, thought Mrs. Fisher. Such implications. Mrs. Arbuthnot clearly thought so too, for she had turned red. And family affection, said Lady Caroline, or was it the Chianti speaking? Surely it was the Chianti. And the want of family affection, said Mrs. Wilkins. What a light she was throwing on her home life and real character. That wouldn't be so bad, said Lady Caroline. I'd stay with that. It would give one room. Oh, no, no. It's dreadful, cried Mrs. Wilkins. It's as if one had no clothes on. But I like that, said Lady Caroline. Really, said Mrs. Fisher. It's a divine feeling, getting rid of things, said Lady Caroline, who was talking altogether to Mrs. Wilkins and paid no attention to the other two. Oh, but in a bitter wind to have nothing on and know there never will be anything on and you going to get colder and colder till at last you die of it. That's what it was like, living with somebody who didn't love one. These confidences, thought Mrs. Fisher, and no excuse whatever for Mrs. Wilkins, who was making them entirely on plain water. Mrs. Arbuthnot, judging from her face, quite shared Mrs. Fisher's disapproval. She was fidgeting. But didn't he? Asked Lady Caroline, every bit as shamelessly unreticent as Mrs. Wilkins. Mellersh, he showed no signs of it. Delicious, murmured Lady Caroline. Really, said Mrs. Fisher. I didn't think it was at all delicious. I was miserable, and now, since I've been here, I simply stare at myself being miserable as that. And about Mellersh. You mean he wasn't worth it? Really, said Mrs. Fisher. No, I don't. I mean I've suddenly got well. Lady Caroline, slowly twisting the stem of her glass in her fingers, scrutinized the lit-up face opposite. And now I'm well. I find I can't sit here and gloat all to myself. I can't be happy shutting him out. I must share. I understand exactly what the blessed damozel felt like. What was the blessed damozel? Asked Scrap. Really, said Mrs. Fisher, and with such emphasis this time that Lady Caroline turned to her. Ought I to know? She asked. I don't know any natural history. It sounds like a bird. It is a poem, said Mrs. Fisher with extraordinary frost. Oh, said Scrap. I'll lend it to you, said Mrs. Wilkins, over whose face laughter rippled. No, said Scrap. And its author, said Mrs. Fisher icily, though not perhaps quite what one would have wished him to be, was frequently at my father's table. What a bore for you, said Scrap. That's what Mother's always doing, inviting authors. I hate authors. I wouldn't mind them so much if they didn't write books. Go on about Mellersh, she said, turning to Mrs. Wilkins. Really, said Mrs. Fisher. All those empty beds, said Mrs. Wilkins. What empty beds? Asked Scrap. The ones in this house. Why, of course, they each ought to have somebody happy inside them. 8 beds and only 4 people. It's dreadful, dreadful to be so greedy and keep everything just for oneself. I want Rose to ask her husband out, too. You and Mrs. Fisher haven't got husbands, but why not give some friend a glorious time? Rose bit her lip. She turned red, she turned pale. If only Lottie would keep quiet, she thought. It was all very well to have suddenly become a saint and want to love everybody, but need she be so tactless? Rose felt that all her poor sore places were being danced on. If only Lottie would keep quiet. And Mrs. Fisher, with even greater frostiness than that with which she had received Lady Caroline's ignorance of the blessed damozel, said, There is only one unoccupied bedroom in this house. Only one? Echoed Mrs. Wilkins, astonished. Then who are in all the others? We are, said Mrs. Fisher. But we're not in all the bedrooms. There must be at least 6. That leaves 2 over, and the owner told us there were 8 beds. Didn't he, Rose? "There are 6 bedrooms," said Mrs. Fisher, for both she and Lady Caroline had thoroughly searched the house on arriving in order to see which part of it they would be most comfortable in, and they both knew that there were 6 bedrooms. 2 of which were very small, and in one of these small ones Francesca slept in the company of a chair and a chest of drawers, and the other, similarly furnished, was empty. Mrs. Wilkins and Mrs. Arbuthnot had hardly looked at the house, having spent most of their time out of doors gaping at the scenery, and had, in the agitated inattentiveness of their minds when first they began negotiating for San Salvatore, got into their heads that the 8 beds of which the owner spoke were the same as 8 bedrooms, which they were not. There were, indeed, 8 beds, but 4 of them were in Mrs. Wilkins's and Mrs. Arbuthnot's rooms. "There are 6 bedrooms," repeated Mrs. Fisher. "We have 4, Francesca has the 5th, and the 6th is empty." "So that," said Scrap, "however kind we feel we would be if we could, we can't. Isn't it fortunate?" "But then there's only room for 1," said Mrs. Wilkins, looking round at the 3 faces. "Yes, and you've got 'em," said Scrap. Mrs. Wilkins was taken aback. This question of the beds was unexpected. In inviting Mellersh, she had intended to put him in one of the 4 spare rooms that she imagined were there. When there were plenty of rooms and enough servants, there was no reason why they should, as they did in their small, 2-servanted house at home, share the same one. Love, even universal love, the kind of love with which she felt herself flooded, should not be tried. Much patience and self-effacement were needed for successful married sleep. Placidity, a steady faith, these too were needed. She was sure she would be much fonder of Mellersh, and he not mind her nearly so much, if they were not shut up together at night. If in the morning they could meet with the cheery affection of friends, between whom lies no shadow of differences about the window or the washing arrangements, or of absurd little choked-down resentments at something that had seemed to one of them unfair. Her happiness, she felt, and her ability to be friends with everybody was the result of her sudden new freedom and its peace. Would there be that sense of freedom, that peace, after a night shut up with Mellersh? Would she be able in the morning to be full towards him, as she was at that moment, full of nothing at all but loving kindness? After all, she hadn't been very long in heaven. Suppose she hadn't been in it long enough for her to have become fixed in blandness, and only that morning what an extraordinary joy it had been to find herself alone when she woke, and able to pull the bedclothes any way she liked. Francesca had to nudge her. She was so much absorbed that she did not notice the pudding. "If," thought Mrs. Wilkins, distractedly helping herself, "I share my room with Mellersh, I risk losing all I now feel about him. If, on the other hand, I put him in the 1 spare room, I prevent Mrs. Fisher and Lady Caroline from giving somebody a treat. True, they don't seem to want to at present, but at any moment in this place one or the other of them may be seized with a desire to make somebody happy, and then they wouldn't be able to because of Mellersh." "What a problem," she said aloud, her eyebrows puckered. "What is?" asked Scrap. "Where to put Mellersh." Scrap stared. "Why, isn't 1 room enough for him?" she asked. "Oh, yes, quite. But then there won't be any room left at all, any room for somebody you may want to invite." "I shan't want to," said Scrap. "Or you," said Mrs. Wilkins to Mrs. Fisher. "Rose, of course, doesn't count. I'm sure she would like sharing her room with her husband. It's written all over her." "Really?" said Mrs. Fisher. "Really what?" asked Mrs. Wilkins, turning hopefully to her, for she thought the word this time was the preliminary to a helpful suggestion. It was not. It stood by itself. It was, as before, mere frost. Challenged, however, Mrs. Fisher did fasten it onto a sentence. "Really am I to understand," she asked, "that you propose to reserve the 1 spare room for the exclusive use of your own family?" "He isn't my own family," said Mrs. Wilkins. "He's my husband, you see." "I see nothing." Mrs. Fisher could not this time refrain from interrupting, for what an intolerable trick. "At the most I hear, and that reluctantly." But Mrs. Wilkins, as impervious to rebuke as Mrs. Fisher had feared, immediately repeated the tiresome formula and launched out into a long and excessively indelicate speech about the best place for the person she called Mellersh to sleep in. Mellersh. Mrs. Fisher, remembering the Thomases and Johns and Alfreds and Roberts of her day, plain names that yet had all become glorious, thought it sheer affectation to be christened Mellersh. Was, it seemed, Mrs. Wilkins's husband, and therefore his place was clearly indicated. Why this talk? She herself, as if foreseeing his arrival, had had a second bed put in Mrs. Wilkins's room. There were certain things in life which were never talked about, but only done. Most things connected with husbands were not talked about, and to have a whole dinner table taken up with a discussion as to where one of them should sleep was an affront to the decencies. How and where husbands slept should be known only to their wives. Sometimes it was not known to them, and then the marriage had less happy moments, but these moments were not talked about either. The decencies continued to be preserved. At least, it was so in her day. To have to hear whether Mr. Wilkins should or should not sleep with Mrs. Wilkins, and the reasons why he should and the reasons why he shouldn't, was both uninteresting and indelicate. She might have succeeded in imposing propriety and changing the conversation if it had not been for Lady Caroline. Lady Caroline encouraged Mrs. Wilkins and threw herself into the discussion with every bit as much unreserve as Mrs. Wilkins herself. No doubt she was impelled on this occasion by Chianti, but whatever the reason, there it was. And, characteristically, Lady Caroline was all for Mr. Wilkins being given the solitary spare room. She took that for granted. Any other arrangement would be impossible, she said. Her expression was barbarous. Had she never read her Bible, Mrs. Fisher was tempted to inquire, "And they two shall be one flesh?" Clearly also, then, one room. But Mrs. Fisher did not inquire. She did not care even to allude to such texts to someone unmarried. However, there was one way she could force Mr. Wilkins into his proper place and save the situation. She could say she herself intended to invite a friend. It was her right. They had all said so. Apart from propriety, it was monstrous that Mrs. Wilkins should want to monopolize the one spare room, when in her own room was everything necessary for her husband. Perhaps she really would invite somebody, not invite, but suggest coming. There was Kate Lumley, for instance. Kate could perfectly afford to come and pay her share, and she was of her own period and knew, and had known, most of the people she herself knew and had known. Kate, of course, had only been on the fringe. She used to be asked only to the big parties, not to the small ones, and she still was only on the fringe. There were some people who never got off the fringe, and Kate was one. Often, however, such people were more permanently agreeable to be with than the others, in that they remained grateful. Yes, she might really consider Kate. The poor soul had never married, but then everybody could not expect to marry, and she was quite comfortably off. Not too comfortably, but just comfortably enough to pay her own expenses if she came, and yet be grateful. Yes, Kate was the solution. If she came at one stroke, Mrs. Fisher saw, would the Wilkinses be regularized, and Mrs. Wilkins be prevented from having more than her share of the rooms. Also, Mrs. Fisher would save herself from isolation, spiritual isolation. She desired physical isolation between meals, but she disliked that isolation which is of the spirit. Such isolation would, she feared, certainly be hers with these three alien-minded young women. Even Mrs. Arbuthnot was, owing to her friendship with Mrs. Wilkins, necessarily alien-minded. In Kate, she would have a support. Kate, without intruding on her sitting room, for Kate was tractable, would be there at meals to support her. Mrs. Fisher said nothing at the moment, but presently in the drawing-room, when they were gathered round the wood fire, she had discovered there was no fireplace in her own sitting-room, and therefore she would after all be forced, so long as the evenings remained cool, to spend them in the other room. Presently, while Francesca was handing coffee round and Lady Caroline was poisoning the air with smoke, Mrs. Wilkins, looking relieved and pleased, said, "Well, if nobody really wants that room and wouldn't use it anyhow, I shall be very glad if Mellersh may have it." "Of course he must have it," said Lady Caroline. Then Mrs. Fisher spoke. "I have a friend," she said in her deep voice, and sudden silence fell upon the others. "Kate Lumley," said Mrs. Fisher. Nobody spoke. "Perhaps," continued Mrs. Fisher, addressing Lady Caroline, "you know her?" No, Lady Caroline did not know Kate Lumley, and Mrs. Fisher, without asking the others if they did, for she was sure they knew no one, proceeded. "I wish to invite her to join me," said Mrs. Fisher. Complete silence. Then Scrap said, turning to Mrs. Wilkins, "That settles Mellersh, then." "It settles the question of Mr. Wilkins," said Mrs. Fisher, "although I am unable to understand that there should ever have been a question in the only way that is right." "I'm afraid you're in for it, then," said Lady Caroline, again to Mrs. Wilkins, "unless," she added, "he can't come." But Mrs. Wilkins, her brow perturbed, for suppose after all she were not yet quite stable in heaven, could only say, a little uneasily, "I see him here."